感谢我是 ZG， 感谢艺人，感谢金生，感谢 JZ， 感谢 T， 感谢如是我们，感谢麦团，谢谢这些观众朋友们对我们的支持。稍后华尔街联报继续为您带来过去24小时的最新新闻以及其他相关评论。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。在以色列和哈马斯发生冲突的今天，世界上的一些大国无疑将在其中发挥重要作用。而我们今天要讨论的大国将是指美国、中国、俄罗斯和欧盟这4股力量。大国竞争决定地缘政治的观念在最近几年又重新流行起来。分析人士认为，大国将调动巨大的资源来塑造国际秩序，他们的所作所为将会影响全球事务。他们可以利用自己的经济和军事力量进行代理人战争，无论一个国家做什么，其他几个国家都会以同样的方式回应。外交事务网站最近就发表了这样一篇文章，分析了中东危机揭示了全球新秩序的哪些方面，并且指出这是一个大国分心的时代。对于目前的4个超级大国来说，这种竞争整合了军事、经济、技术和外交努力。俄乌战争就是一个很典型的例子。普京表示，他的入侵是抵制美国在欧洲的主导地位。乌克兰战争确实加深了俄罗斯、美国和欧洲之间的紧张关系。与冷战初期的柏林危机一样，乌克兰的战争也向外辐射，产生了新的移民问题，并且引发了通货膨胀。但是在大国竞争框架的背后，却隐藏着更加微妙的新发展，那就是大国不再是二元的。美国和欧洲有正式的联盟关系，而中国和俄罗斯有伙伴关系。美国对绿色技术的补贴使得欧洲和美国相互对立，而美国和中国深刻的经济相互依存又使中美成为犹豫不决的对手。各个国家国内的政治分歧也阻碍了大国的国际野心。因此文章指出，未来几个月受以色列哈马斯战争影响的各方将会寻求大国的领导，但是他们可能会发现当今的这4个大国都不足以来应对危机。俄罗斯依赖伊朗提供军事援助，美国可能会向以色列提供大力支持，但很难让巴勒斯坦人坐到谈判桌前。中国则会继续提出关于和平解决问题的老生常谈，并且避免任何形式的直接参与，而欧盟则将发现他们基本上没有什么影响力。而这种局面的出现将是21世纪国际秩序的一个缩影。欧洲长期以来一直寻求利用其强大的软实力将其价值观应用于世界危机。然而欧洲是一个名不副实的大国，因为欧洲的军事实力与其经济实力不相匹配。由于其武装部队分散在几个不同的主权国家和北约当中，欧洲无法像俄罗斯或者美国那样快速投射军事力量。总的来说，欧盟和英国掌握着巨大的经济和军事资源，享受了数十年的稳定。但是俄罗斯对乌克兰的入侵令战争再次回到欧洲大陆，欧洲需要在军事上保卫自己。欧洲在加强乌克兰防御方面常常落后于美国，这场战争也暴露了欧盟作为国际舞台上重要力量的弱点。欧盟众多国家的利益和战略重点并不一致，他们有着各自不同的噩梦。意大利担心移民，波兰担心俄罗斯的侵略，葡萄牙担心它的经济状况。欧洲的政治格局不利于推行积极主动的外交政策。面对阿塞拜疆的进攻，亚美尼亚人大规模逃离，科索沃和塞尔维亚之间的紧张局势再度升级，以及苏丹的内战等等，欧盟更多是一个旁观者，而不是一个有效的斡旋者。在非洲，后殖民国家也没有忘记欧洲殖民历史的掠夺。非洲地区连续发生政变，驱逐了欧洲军队，甚至驱逐了一些欧洲大使。欧盟对此也没有做出实际回应。而美国这边，美国有能力成为更具有决定性的角色。虽然川普的上台让美国的外交政策陷入困境，但是美国仍然是世界上综合实力最强的大国，无论是从经济到情报机构再到军事实力。拜登政府则恢复了世界对美国国际角色的关注。为了与中国的一带一路倡议相竞争，美国在最近公布了一项计划，投资一条新的经济走廊，以加强欧盟、印度和中东之间的运输和贸易联系。华盛顿最近还加强了在印太地区的伙伴关系。 拜登团队为以色列与沙特关系正常化付出了相当大的努力。但是美国的外交政策也受到想法与能力之间差距的限制。乌克兰战争已经消耗了拜登政府大量的注意力，对乌克兰武器弹药的供应也造成资源的紧张，而这些武器和弹药现在可能影响到以色列，或者将来影响到台湾。另外，华盛顿对西非正在发生的战争和危机的关注充其量也只是一个间歇性的。可以说，和以色列总理内塔尼亚胡一样，拜登对哈马斯最近的袭击也是完全措手不及。而文章指出，如果说美国作为一个大国的地位正在动摇，那并不是因为美国国会中一些煽动性的声音所说的，是因为乌克兰战争所造成的。文章认为，美国今天地位的不稳定，是因为美国国内政治的两极分化所造成的。政治两极分化以及美国政府行政部门和立法部门之间的日益疏远，使得外交政策变得不和谐。而由于国会的抵制，美国许多高级外交职位目前都处于空缺的状态。美国的不团结也给其他国家留下了反复无常的印象，导致其行动不够果断。再来说说中国，外交事务网站的文章称，中国是当代大国中最令人困惑的一个。在过去的半个世纪里，中国一直回避代价高昂的战争，并且表现出谨慎的态度。这种避免战争的做法，提高了中国在全球南方的威望，并且巩固了中国作为经济强国，而不是地缘政治挑衅者的声誉。习近平尚未宣布入侵台湾，文章认为他可能永远都不会这样做。与欧洲相比，中国拥有更加集中的军事力量，而且使用频率不高，不像俄罗斯和美国那样过度扩张。然而，中国尚未将其经济影响力和互不侵犯的声誉转化为对全球问题的成功管理者。比如说，今年2月，中国提出了乌克兰和平计划，但是并没有认真对待。北京表面上摆出调解人的姿态，却没有采取任何具体行动来结束战争。事实上，中国对俄罗斯的支持延长了战争。北京与莫斯科始终保持着重要的国防工业关系，并且在国际论坛上尽量保护俄罗斯免受批评。中国在俄乌战争上的混乱立场，令中国在全球外交事务上的影响力减弱。外交事务网站称，中国是世界上最热心，但是能力最差的调解者之一。今年3月，北京大张旗鼓地宣布了沙特阿拉伯和伊朗之间的和平协议，并且表示希望在以色列和巴勒斯坦之间达成类似的协议。但是迄今为止，中国的努力并没有为该地区的和平与稳定做出任何贡献。与此同时，中国正遭受着自己的经济问题，令它自顾不暇。最后来说一说俄罗斯，自从俄乌战争以来，为自己背上了一场无法打赢的战争包袱。战争消耗了俄罗斯大量的人力财力，莫斯科需要数年的时间来重建军队。战争的失利使得俄罗斯曾经威名赫赫的军事形象也大打折扣，暴露出俄罗斯军队在战略上的平庸。莫斯科为其在乌克兰的野心分配的预算也已经捉襟见肘。中东长期以来一直是大国竞争的中心舞台。2011年爆发的叙利亚内战令我们看到一个国家如何成为无数对手争夺的多个战场，其中包括伊斯兰国的恐怖分子、土耳其、以色列和伊朗，还有俄罗斯和美国的军队也在该地区共存，既不结盟也不对抗。而今天，以色列与哈马斯的新战争有可能扩大为一场同样难以控制的大火，席卷黎巴嫩和叙利亚等邻国。文章指出，我们不应该怀念过去的大国竞争时代，大国竞争导致了1战和2战，而冷战时期苏联和美国的激烈竞争则一度濒临核战争。但是当前的竞争和分心的混合情况会带来一个新的问题，那就是大国的野心相互碰撞，令这些大国的行动十分被动，甚至瘫痪。因此，中型国家、小型国家，甚至非国家行为体之间发生碰撞的危机层出不穷，而这4个大国既无法阻止，也无法遏制。大国分心会带来相当大的长期风险，它会招致其他行为体的修正主义和冒险行为。阿塞拜疆不是一个超级大国，只有1000万人口，但是它却能够肆无忌惮地行事。而哈马斯根本不是一个国家，但它却敢攻击一个拥有世界级军事力量和国际伙伴的国家。因此，随着中东紧张局势的加剧，我们应该看到大国竞争不能成为世界唯一的焦点， 因为当今世界不仅仅是一个大国竞争的时代，它更是一个分裂的时代，一个大国分心的时代。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢，记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
Hello， 大家好，欢迎关注华尔街电视频道。这期的热点深度关注这几年可能是中国互联网上最被忌讳提及的一位明代皇帝崇祯帝。2023年10月16日这一周，有一本历史书被通知因印刷问题而全部下架召回。这本书叫做《崇祯勤政的亡国君》。根据中国大陆图书零售网站北方图书城的简介，涉事的作品在2023年9月1日出版，出版商为文汇出版社。那作为作者是陈梧桐。陈梧桐为中共党员，曾任中央民族学院的历史系系主任。在2023年5月31日在北京因病去世，终年88岁。那这本《崇祯勤政的亡国君》是作者去世后的首部再版作品，是收录了陈先生的手稿。那崇祯勤政的亡国君讲述的是明朝末代皇帝崇祯的亡国之路。封面的简介说昏招连连步步错，越是勤政越亡国。在北方图书城的购书网站上，关于这本书的介绍提到，公元1644年，当李自成率军攻破北京，崇祯皇帝无路可逃，留下接诸陈务正的遗言，在眉山自缢。那延续了276年的明朝自此灭亡。然而崇祯并非传统意义上沉迷酒色、穷奢极欲、穷兵黩武的亡国之君，而是勤政节俭励精图治。然而一个励精图治的皇帝为何沦为了亡国之君呢？有人认为明朝实际亡于万历，崇祯只是无力回天。更有人推论是历史让崇祯皇帝演出了一个非亡国之君的亡国悲剧。事实真是如此吗？在这本书中中国明史学会顾问、北京师范大学特聘教授陈梧桐从财政、党争、军事、用人等等的角度，是带领读者看懂崇祯皇帝如何昏招迭出，走上亡国之路。所以这本书是一本历史著作，只不过应该是用了一个比较通俗的手法来讲述历史。那这本封面上还写到昏招连连步步错，越是勤政越亡国。在这个简介里还说翻开本书，看懂崇祯皇帝是如何一步步把自己逼上绝路。网传是由发行商独克文化股份有限公司在10月16日发出的下架通知函，就说这本书是遇到了印刷问题，必须全部下架。各大网站、新华书店及民营经销商需即刻下架。不过究竟书商所说这本书的印刷问题到底是哪里，具体是什么问题目前我们是不知道的。当前在中国的电商平台，比如当当网、京东购物、天猫、淘宝中搜索这本书籍是无法找到或显示。那显示的只是暂不支持购买及抱歉，该商品已下架。但既然是再版的作品，有细心的网民就找到了陈梧桐先生在2016年出版的另外一本书，叫做《崇祯往事：明帝国最后的图景》这一本书。那通过对比崇祯勤政的亡国君和这本《崇祯往事：明帝国最后的图景》这两本书的目录可以发现，这本崇祯勤政的亡国君和崇祯往事明帝国最后的图景在内容上应该是一样的。那到底是哪出了问题，出现了所谓的印刷问题呢？有人说这本书的问题就出在重新制作的书籍封面和腰封上。再对比崇祯勤政的亡国君和崇祯往事明帝国最后的图景两本书的封面，那答案应该是不言自明。新一版的书，再版后的书，那它的封面是更加的吸引眼球，描述也更为大胆。但这在一些非常敏感的人看来，那肯定是犯了忌讳，类似于你不要以为我不知道你在用明朝影射现在。但其实崇祯不能提这个情况，3年前那就有了。 在2020年2月初，网易这个平台刊出的《崇祯亡国》的时候，大家都在等着他下令。这是一篇解释明帝国末年崇祯走投无路、明帝国覆灭的通俗短文，可以说是不胫而走。但当时的网上全网是把这篇文章给删除。那虽然这个网上是出现了审核，但各种各样的关于这篇文章的复制件照样是在大大小小的朋友圈、社交圈里流行。那综合各种议论，倒不是人们突然大发了这个思古之幽情，而是似乎看到了崇祯亡国与当今这个习近平治理下的中国的某种相同之处。那这篇短文也挺长的，我先给大家汇总一下。这篇短文提到，崇祯为什么亡国？当危机来临的时候，所有人都在等着他的指示。崇祯作为一个亡国之君，是一个悲情人物，尤其是他在上眉山的时候还能回望京城大火，说一句苦吾明耳，更是让后人唏嘘不已。加上清朝初期许多倒行逆施的政策，各地的反清复明活动也一直持续不断，但大多数都要和崇祯扯上一点关系。可以说，在清初的一段时间，崇祯的声誉反而是越来越高。崇祯呢有一个最大的特点，就是非常的勤政。在明朝的皇帝里，除了太祖和孝宗之外，可以说就没有比崇祯更勤政的皇帝了。而且因为孝宗时期对阁臣还是比较尊重，也比较倚重大臣的辅佐，但崇祯不同。崇祯时期虽然在制度上也还是沿用了之前的内阁制，但是因为他很勤政，而且对阁臣动辄抚阅相加，所以内阁实际上形同虚设。在这个意义上，崇祯时期的制度也是最接近朱元璋时期的。官僚制发展到明朝已经是非常成熟，甚至在有些时期几乎是处在无人驾驶的状态，但它也是能够自己正常运行，并且应对一些危机。最典型的就是武宗时期，武宗天性活泼好动，比较爱玩，不怎么理朝政，甚至内阁大臣也见不了几次面。但即使在这样的情况下，官僚体系还是按照自己的逻辑运转，平定了当时波及整个中原复兴地带的这个叛乱。官僚制差不多就是在两种极端状态之间来回摇摆。一种极端状态就是武宗时期甚至万历这种情况下，皇帝几乎不管，但是官僚体系呢仍然是能够正常运转，完成自己应承担的任务。也就是说，可以在无人驾驶的状态下正常运转。而另一种状态则是被驯服之后的状态，也是完全按照上级的命令行事。无论什么情况，哪怕是天塌下来，他也一定要按照规定的程序来运转，完全不理会现实的危机。崇祯亡国的时候，所有人都在等着他下令。那不知道这本书在解决了所谓的印刷问题之后，是否能够尽早再次出版上架。好了，以上就是今天热点深度的所有内容。更多资讯可以关注六度简报网，网址是6度brief.com， 在上面各位可以订阅各类符合您喜好的简报新闻，有免费套餐，也有更加专业的付费套餐供大家选择。今天的视频就到这里，我们下个节目再见。
斯科特·帕特森带来了一本不同寻常的书，至少对于我来说，它产生了与观看黑镜剧集相同的效果。你以为自己知道故事的发展方向，然后突然所有的锚点都以一种非常不愉快的方式消失了。在《混沌之王》这本书中，一开始是对马克、斯皮茨纳格尔和纳西姆·塔勒布的生平进行有趣而节奏紧凑的描述，他们是金融风险尾部对冲方法的开发者。帕特森是一位资深的《华尔街日报》记者，他对塔勒布在虚值货币期权上进行的一项交易的详细描述，使人觉得这本书将迎合金融迷们的口味。然而，在书的最后1/5部分，叙述采取了一种党派的外衣，它被呈现为一个毫无争议的事实，即美国实施碳税并向公众提供退款是一个明显明智的举措。只有那些否认科学或受到大石油公司贿赂的人才会反对。帕特森对各种专家提出的其他应对气候变化的可能解决方案只是敷衍了事，但他自信地向我们保证，最终地球工程是一个糟糕的解决方案。之后，帕特森详细描述了 2021年1月6日的事件。他平静地解释说，右翼媒体将一群暴力围攻国会的暴徒的叙述转变为一群和平抗议者为保护民主而集会的叙述，并称美国的民主处于危险之中。将2021年1月6日的处理与对乔治·弗洛伊德之死的一带而过的提及进行对比，作者称之为抗议活动，并没有提到左翼媒体如何滑稽地将这些抗议活动描绘为大多数和平，而城市却在燃烧。最后，为了展示书的意识形态不平衡的叙述，举一个例子，民主党的巨额捐赠者山姆·班克曼弗里德是以有效利他主义为背景介绍的。读者们了解到，有效利他主义者追求能够产生最高可能收益的职业道路，从而实现最高可能的捐赠。3页之后，当结束对班克曼弗里德的报道时，书中透露 FTX 在2022年末崩溃，这对年轻的班克曼弗里德来说是一个关于由黑天鹅和龙王主导的金融市场的混乱、常常暴力的本质的严酷教训。然后只有一句话用来描述班克曼弗里德被指控监督了大量的欺诈行为，但又有一句话说他否认了这些指控。尽管我本来期望《纽约时报》的记者比《华尔街日报》的记者更好一些，但这本书的前80%仍然值得阅读。对于那些对富人和聪明人的生活方式感兴趣的人来说，尤其如此。具体而言，这本书概述了处理极端风险的2种主要方法。首先，有黑天鹅方法，由斯皮茨纳格尔和塔勒布开发，其中我们不知道的东西。然后有龙王方法，由法国数学家迪迪埃·索内特青睐，其中我们可以充分模拟极端和罕见事件的概率，并以此做好准备。在本文的其余部分，我将总结黑天鹅方法，因为这是我更了解的方法，也更吸引对奥地利经济学感兴趣的读者。声明：我与斯皮茨纳格尔和塔勒布通信过，并在斯皮茨纳格尔的2本书中担任顾问。我认为描述斯皮茨纳格尔和塔勒布方法的最佳方式是，他们认为金融市场中的大多数参与者低估了系统风险的水平。在本文中，我使用风险一词的是指日常意义，而不是奥地利学派对数量风险和质量不确定性之间的标准区分。例如，股市的标准模型假设指数遵循随机游走，带有上升趋势，未来水平当然是未知的，但其价值是从一个行为良好的高斯分布，类似于中型曲线中抽取的。极端的高回报或大崩盘的异常值是如此罕见，以至于可以忽略不计。然而，正如分型先驱本瓦·曼德尔布罗特在书中解释的那样，在10年的时间里，真正决定胜负的只有10天。曼德尔布罗特解释说，巨额财富是在很少的几天内创造的，而巨大的灾难也发生在很少的几天内，所以人们陷入了一种非常令人不安的境地。也就是说，在这种情况下，只有非常少见的事件才占压倒性的地位，其他的几乎不重要。在他的书《被随机性愚弄》中，塔勒表达了一种相关的沮丧，回忆起与传统金融人士的会议，他们围着桌子问每个人对市场未来走势的最佳猜测是什么。塔勒认为这种框架过于简单化，更合适的回答应该是我预计市场会上涨这么多点，但至少有10%的可能性它会下跌超过2%。这是我的话，我在转述塔勒的观点。至于斯皮茨纳格尔，他在芝加哥交易场的导师埃弗雷特·克利普教给他的座右铭是“你必须喜欢失败”。这个想法是，你必须耐心地忍受一连串的小挫折，以便在合适的时机获得巨大的回报。在他的书《资本之道》中，斯皮茨纳格尔将这与伯姆·巴维克的迂回性概念联系起来。在他们共同经营的 Empirical Capital 基金和斯皮茨纳格尔的 Universal Investments 基金仍然受益于塔勒布的咨询中，两人开创了被称为尾部对冲或动态对冲的方法。基本思想很简单，每个人都知道，随着时间的推移，股市会上涨。然而，问题在于股市非常波动。减少风险的一种典型方法是通过一些固定收益证券，理想情况下是来自稳定公司或美国财政部的安全证券稀释投资组合对股票的敞口， 例如保持60%的股票和40%的债券。然而，斯皮茨纳格尔和塔勒布的理论和实践表明，对冲的更好选择是保持97%的股票市场多头仓位，同时将剩余3%的投资组合用于不断滚动的深度虚值看跌期权。看跌期权赋予持有人以在指定的行权价出售标的资产的权利，但没有义务。因此，如果标普500指数当前为4000点，交易员可以购买一份看跌期权，该期权在未来12个月内随时以3000点的价格出售标普500指数。如果在1年的时间里市场没有跌破3000点，那么这些看跌期权将变得毫无价值。然而，如果市场跌至2000点，那么这些期权将非常有价值，可以以2000点的价格买入，并以3000点的价格卖出，获得差价，或者更直接地说，以反映1000点差距的价格将期权卖给他人。在这种情况下，看跌期权的原始购买者将获得巨大的利润，因为在购买时，大多数人认为在接下来的1年里，股市下跌超过25%，从4000点下跌到3000点的可能性非常小，因此期权的原始购买价格会相当低。通过这种类型的尾部对冲多头仓位，斯皮茨纳格尔和塔勒布的基金在上涨的牛市中仍然会增值，因为他们仍然有97%的上行敞口，只有3%的拖累来自将要购买但从未行使的期权。然而，在市场崩盘期间，看跌期权的市场价值会爆炸式增长，而传统对冲基金则只能通过大量债券稀释损失。以下是《混沌之王》一书中的一段摘录，捕捉到这2位创新者所取得的成就的本质。到2020年初，这是一个非常成功的策略。安永会计师事务所从2008年到2019年12月审计了 Universa 的黑天鹅策略，并发现其投资资本的平均年回报率，这是衡量对冲基金成功或失败的常见指标，达到了惊人的105%。也就是说 ，Universa 的平均年回报率为105%，这个业绩使其与世界上最好的对冲基金相媲美，甚至更好。这甚至还没有包括2020年初的4000%以上的巨额收益。这些收益完全是在 Universa 的任何人对市场的走势、上涨、下跌或横盘都没有做出任何预测的情况下实现的。但是，虽然斯皮茨纳格尔永远不会试图预测市场何时会崩盘，但他确实深信美国股市和债市受到中央银行干预的推动，长期以来一直陷入了一个不可持续的超级泡沫，最终将像装满 TNT 的桶一样爆炸。斯皮茨纳格尔世界观的一个核心原则是，美联储几十年来一直沉迷于吹泡沫，为崩盘创造了干柴。加粗部分为添加的内容。正如我在加粗的引文的后半部分所示，斯皮茨纳格尔的观点与奥地利学派非常吻合。在本书的其他地方，帕特森解释说，斯皮茨纳格尔是罗恩·保罗的粉丝。我还应该补充的是，与一些金融媒体上只是为了吸引某个特定人群而滥用名字的大师不同，斯皮茨纳格尔是真正的行家，他对困难的经济文本进行了认真的研究。资本之道将芝加哥交易所的投资哲学与奥地利生产结构方法相结合，而他最近的避风港则深入增强了我对丹尼尔·伯努利和约翰·凯利关于不确定性和效用理论的理解。最后，我将对比一下帕特森在《混沌之王》中对预防原则的强调与斯皮茨纳格尔在避风港中提出的标准及成本效益的风险缓解。可以理解为什么帕特森在他的书中如此强调预防原则。他的叙述中有很多内容，特别是在最后几章中涉及到了金融以外的话题，如气候变化和大流行病。预防原则敦促在极端情况下极度谨慎，当潜在的危害是系统性的，后果可能涉及到完全不可逆转的毁灭，比如人类的灭绝，正如塔勒布和合著者在引用的一篇论文中解释的那样。无论一个人是否同意预防原则，以及他在这些严重政治化领域的典型应用，帕特森并没有发明这种方法，他将其编织到他关于股市尾部分布的叙述中是有道理的，特别是因为多产的塔勒布在所有这些不同的主题上都写过。然而，在实践中， 真正行使预防原则在投资中的唯一方法就是根本不投资。当然，这样的政策会使人面临无法处理未来问题的不足财富的不同风险。这就是为什么对预防原则的字面解释可能是令人犹豫和自我毁灭的。与这个标准相比，人们可以采取斯皮茨纳格尔在避风港中解释的方法。正如我在本文前面概述的那样，斯皮茨纳格尔表明，华尔街传统的风险管理方法成本过高，有时治疗方法比疾病更糟糕。通过60-40投资组合的例子，斯皮茨纳格尔表明，源自芝加哥学派的标准均值方差回报风险框架是根本错误的。斯科特·帕特森的《混沌之王》为那些已经了解斯皮茨纳格尔和塔勒布的工作，并想了解他们的起源故事的读者提供了有趣的背景。然而，要真正理解他们对金融市场的深刻见解，我鼓励读者阅读我之前提到的其他书籍。
China is more likely to blockade Taiwan than invade the island in the next 10 years. As we've observed Chinese actions against Taiwan, particularly after the unprecedented large-scale Chinese military exercise after then Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, it has sparked quite a bit of discussion in D.C. about how likely is it that China may blockade Taiwan, and how should Taiwan, as well as the United States, think about the likelihood of blockade versus an invasion. And here I'm very, very grateful that I have two very established and esteemed experts on the PLA to join us here today. I will introduce them shortly, but the first thing, as we do in all of these debates, is we will have a quick vote on what you think might happen, what you think is more likely. So, yep, please. Again, this is if you agree or disagree that China is more likely to blockade than invade Taiwan in the next 10 years. So as we're waiting for the poll, let me introduce our two speakers. To my left, immediately to my left, and arguing for this proposition is Mr. Lonnie Henley. He's a senior fellow at the Foreign Policy Research Institute. He retired from federal service in 2019 after more than 40 years as an intelligence officer specializing in East Asian security. He served as a defense intelligence officer for East Asia, senior defense intelligence analyst for China, and the National Intelligence Collection Officer for East Asia, among many other posts during his 4 decades of work in the intelligence community. Arguing against this proposition is Dr. Phil Saunders. He's the director for the Center for the Chinese Military Affairs at the National Defense University. He previously worked at the Monterey Institute of International Studies and served as an officer in the United States Air Force. Phil also asked me to make a plug for his very excellent book, Crossing the Strait, China's Military Prepares for War with Taiwan. It was published last year, highly recommended. I believe it's a volume of leading scholars on their assessment of China's preparations for the Taiwan contingency. So with that, let's turn back to the poll. We are seeing that 73% of the audience, both in person and online, believe that a blockade is more likely than an invasion. And so, Lonnie, you are going first, and you have the advantage of arguing for the position that blockade is more likely. So over to you, Lonnie. Oh, sorry, before we do that, let me also show the poll from Twitter. Right, it's the poll that we got today is very much in agreement with our polling that we got on Twitter in the last couple of days. A very large portion, almost 80%, believe that a blockade is more likely than an invasion. So Lonnie, over to you.
Well, I've got the easy part of this task, partly because my work is already done for me. Everybody already agrees. But so I'm going to argue that if there's a military conflict over Taiwan, that will involve a blockade, absolutely. And then I'm going to argue against myself that to set up the conditions where I think it is not the case that a blockade is more likely than an invasion, but that's a very peculiar argument. We'll get into that. And then I'll finish with my, my premise that we have failed to prepare for this blockade, and that's a bad thing. So, first of all, agreeing with everything that was said in the previous panel about whether a military conflict is likely, and I agree that it is not the most likely course of events in the foreseeable future. But if the Chinese leadership decides that it must use military force against Taiwan, and then there's kind of two big categories of actions they would take. The first big category is coercive actions to force Taiwan to change some policy or some behavior or some condition that the Chinese have found unacceptable. And if they're thinking about coercive actions, then they've got various kind of non-violent coercive actions, if you will, economic sanctions, saber rattling of the sort that we've seen twice in the last year with large exercises around Taiwan. But if they decide they must use military force in the sense of shooting, killing people and breaking things, then they've got a couple of small options on their menu. They can seize an offshore island. They can do punitive strikes, air and missile strikes against Taiwan, or they can impose a blockade on Taiwan to impose economic pain. I have a hard time imagining them deciding to kill people and not at the same time also deciding to throw up a blockade. So if they're going to do a seizure of an offshore island or air and missile bombardment of the island of Taiwan, they will also put up a blockade because that's a much more overt political message to the world that this is not acceptable, whatever it is that Taiwan has done that annoyed them. So, in the big category of coercive actions to punish Taiwan, there will almost certainly be a blockade if they decide they're willing to use lethal force. The other big bin is actions to compel unification, that is, to conquer and occupy Taiwan. There they have two major courses of action they can choose. One is just to impose a major blockade and hold it as long as they can, and the other is to launch an invasion. Now, the way I win this argument automatically is that if they launch an invasion, they will do a blockade first as part of that invasion. They've got to set the conditions for the amphibious landing. They've got to attain maritime superiority, air superiority, and information superiority, at least sufficient for the cross-strait operation to succeed. So, even if their primary course of action is an invasion, they will be a blockade, so I win. The other course of action, of course, is just to not attempt an invasion, but just do a really serious blockade and hold it as long as they possibly can. That has some advantages. It doesn't have the high risk of immediate operational failure that you would have with a cross-strait invasion, but it has a lot of disadvantages, such as it gives the U.S. a lot of time to marshal force, both militarily and politically, in opposition to the blockade, and it's a long, slow weapon. You've got to, it takes a while for Taiwan to starve and surrender. I would also say that, contrary to a comment earlier, we, collectively, the United States and Taiwan, are investing quite a lot in efforts to defeat a potential cross-strait invasion. There's more to be done on that, in that regard on both sides, but that's been the major focus of military force development as pertains to the Taiwan Strait situation. It's been the major focus of U.S. force development for more than a decade, and is increasingly the focus of Taiwan force. Well, in one sense, it has always been, but they're focusing more on the effort to defeat the cross-strait movement as opposed to defeating the force as it lands on the beach. In any case, we're putting a lot of effort into defeating that cross-strait movement. And there's a pretty good chance we would succeed, given the amount of effort we're putting into it and given the incredible difficulty of that operation from the PLA's perspective. It's by far the largest amphibious operation any force has ever attempted in history. It's got enormous geographical obstacles, etc. We can go into long detail on that. And our planning seems to be premised on the assumption that if we defeat the landing, that ends the war. That the Chinese will find some political formula that allows them to claim a strategic victory despite the military operational outcome and declare victory and go home and the war's over. That might happen. I don't think it would, and I definitely don't think we should assume that it will happen. We've got to look at the possibility that for whatever reason, if only because at this point, we've been fighting for a month. Tens of thousands of people have been killed on all sides of this, in Taiwan especially, in China, in the U.S. forces operating in the area, in Japan. Thousands of Japanese people have died. I can't see the Chinese deciding at that point that they're going to kind of give up and claim that they won but give up the effort. I just think at that point, everyone is so outraged, everyone is so, in any case, it doesn't matter. Whether it's likely or not, we should prepare for the possibility that China doesn't just quit and go home at that point. And at that point, think about it, we've been fighting for a month. China has fired off every long-range weapon it has, so have we. The Chinese Navy operating in the Western Pacific has been destroyed. The U.S. Navy has been severely damaged. It's questionable whether the Chinese air defense umbrella over Taiwan is still intact. I think probably will, but you never know what a secret weapon the U.S. Air Force has up its sleeve to take out air defenses. You won't know until it happens. But at this point, if the Chinese decide they must continue the fight, their only remaining option is to continue enforcing the blockade. And I'm not talking about what Dr. Ratner seemed to have in mind earlier this morning, a picket line of Chinese ships in the Western Pacific. That's easy for us to defeat. What we have no way to defeat at the moment is a close-in knife fight in the Taiwan Strait to keep any cargo ships from getting into Taiwan. Because at this point, the lack of long-range weapons doesn't matter because it's a close-in fight. And the fight has to be on the west side of Taiwan, between Taiwan and China, not on the east side of Taiwan, because the east coast ports are so small and the mountainous roads between them and the rest of Taiwan are so fragile that you are not going to get enough material through those east coast ports to keep Taiwan alive. Just cannot happen. Physically impossible. So you've got to come around to the west coast ports to get cargo in to keep Taiwan alive. And at that point, you're in an intensely contested environment, heavily mined, with your back to the Chinese coastline, trying to push cargo ships into a heavily damaged port over and over again, with the Chinese forces throwing everything they still got at you from close range and remining those ports every time you turn your back. And so I think that unless China quits after the first month of the war, unless the first battle ends the war, there will be a long, ugly blockade. And the military forces required to penetrate that blockade are completely different from the military forces that it took to stand back and sink amphibious landing ships from 500 miles out. And we have not built that force. And we're not even planning to build that force. And Taiwan has not built the forces it would need to contribute to that effort to open its ports to us after they've just finished closing the ports against the Chinese invasion fleet and keep and make it possible for that flow of material to come in. So, as I said up front, if there is a war, there will definitely be a blockade. And if there's a serious war, we will lose because of the blockade. Thanks.
Thank you, Lonnie. Before I turn to Phil, I just wanted to quickly recap you. So you were talking about at least 4 different blockade scenarios, right? One, a coercive one to punish Taiwan.
Yes.
Second was a blockade scenario that was aimed at unification but separate and standalone.
Yeah.
The third was a blockade as a first step towards an invasion. And the fourth scenario that you were discussing was a blockade scenario after a faltering invasion.
After a failed invasion,
right.
Yes.
So just wanted to be clear that Lonnie has offered 4 different options. Basically, the opportunity that blockade could be used in peacetime, the beginning of conflict, and near the end of a conflict. Okay, thank you. Philip.
Okay, well, I feel like this is heads I win, tails I lose. Because I think really the question is, if the PRC leadership decides they have to use force, are they willing to do an invasion or not? And is a blockade a substitute for that? So yes, it might be part of the preparation, just like a fire strike campaign would be. It might be a fallback if the invasion has failed. But I think the question we're really concerned about is it an alternative to an invasion? So that's what I'm going to kind of tackle. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as the decision calculus, pros and cons of a blockade, pros and cons of an invasion, and give you a conclusion on why I think in some ways the invasion's a better choice. So I use the basic deterrence calculus. It's whether the benefits of action against Taiwan outweigh the costs and risks, including the costs of inaction. And so that cost of inaction covers a Taiwan declaration of independence. It covers the U.S. Doing something to officially recognize Taiwan, actions that really would force a CCP leader to act. I think those are relatively unlikely if we're smart with our policies. You could also think about circumstances where the trends are moving against China and they act before a window of opportunity is closing. But even that would really be a war of choice. And so if it's a war of choice, I think there's a 2-step calculus. The first is a military step. The second is a broader political step that takes other factors into account. And if we're looking at the military pieces, we want to ask, what's the PLA's ability to achieve its objectives? So do they have the military forces, the hardware, the training to execute the campaign? What's the strength and capability of the opposition force? And is that just Taiwan, or is it Taiwan and the U.S.? How much time, if the campaign goes as planned, would it take to achieve decisive results? What are the expected costs in terms of losses of men and equipment? And expected is what you factored in. That's what I'm going to pay. But you also have risks. And those could be that the losses are a lot higher than you think, that the military operation might not succeed, or it might escalate into a much wider or more violent war. That is either horizontal or vertical escalation. So I think these are the military pieces. Even if the military answer looks relatively good, though, the decision is really going to be made by the CCP leadership, probably Xi Jinping. And that calculus is going to include a much wider range of domestic and international costs and benefits. So they'll be looking at the diplomatic costs. They will be looking at the economic costs of boycotts, sanctions, and the loss of commerce while a war goes on. And obviously those increases the longer you go. The political factors, where does it leave China positioned at the end of the day? What does that mean for other goals like raising the living standards of Chinese people? And I think because of that, the CCP is not likely to do a bolt from the blue. They are going to mount a public campaign on why this is justified. And they'll do that both to mobilize their own public and their own military behind this, but also to reduce the international costs. They're going to find a way to blame Taiwan and or the U.S., and so that political campaign is part of this. So I think the point is that a go answer at the military level doesn't necessarily translate into a go answer at the political calculus. And then just to preview the argument, a blockade absolutely is less challenging than an invasion for the PLA in military terms, but I think the balance of costs and benefits is less appealing at the political level. Okay, so how does a blockade work? Depends on the type, and there's been very good work done here at CSIS looking at a variety of blockades, from ones that don't use a lot of force to the kinds of things that Lonnie is talking about, which is a much more kinetic, violent blockade that's going to include airstrikes on Taiwan's ports that will do a lot. And so depending on that type, it's going to restrict the flow of energy, especially oil and gas, goods inputs, goods exports, the flow of people, and even the flow of information, because one of the tools in the PLA tool bag is an information blockade where they try to cut off Taiwan's internet and space links to the outside world. And this imposes increasing costs as your stockpiles are drowned down, as your economy crumbles to a halt. Rationing starts to affect what businesses can stay open and the livelihoods of people. And the notion that is over time those costs increase and the target will eventually make concessions to end the pain. If we're talking these kinetic blockades, well, that's going to include precision air and missile strikes on ports, on your container facilities, on your airfields, on your communications hubs to increase the effectiveness. This starts to look like a fire strike campaign. This starts to look like a bombing campaign. And we know some of the political negative side effects of that is it rallies the population to support the government and increases the will to resist. So a kinetic blockade that's using a lot of this stuff is going to look a lot like a bombing campaign and have some of those same counterproductive effects. Okay, so the chief advantage of the blockade is the PLA can do it. Much better capability to implement it than an invasion. There's limited Taiwan stockpiles of energy and food, so that's a weakness. You might think you might not have to hold it for too long. They can rely on mainland-based missiles to limit access to Taiwan's ports on the west side. So you can do a lot of this not using aircraft, not using ships, but using cruise missiles and surface-to-air missiles. If it's a more limited conflict, that might make countries and that would force the U.S. and Taiwan to decide, do they want to escalate to mainland strikes in that kind of a. There's some significant drawbacks, though. The kinetic forms of a blockade are a clear attack on Taiwan. That produces much the same costs as an invasion in terms of diplomatic costs, economic costs, sanctions, political costs. It triggers probably the Taiwan Relations Act in that it's an effort to resolve the situation using force. The less kinetic it is, the less effective it is, and the time required is time for adversaries to organize a political coalition, enact sanctions, and move military forces, whether that's from Hawaii, whether that's from CONUS, whether that's from other theaters. And it's unclear whether and how long it'll take a blockade to achieve decisive results. Those are the prospects for a really extended campaign that goes a long way out. It's also worth remembering that a PRC blockade on the Navy is also going to significantly curtail shipping traffic to China, either through the mechanism of insurance costs or because it's an active war zone that nobody wants to sail through. And it also invites a symmetrical policy response of a blockade, a broader blockade against China itself. That's a logical, symmetrical response that people would say is justified. Okay, so that's some of the pros and cons of the blockade. For the invasion, absolutely it is a very challenging military operation, but it offers the prospect of a decisive victory. If you can pull off an invasion, you are in physical control of Taiwan and you can dictate what happens next. And it also potentially, if you're an optimist in the PRC, offers the prospect of a rapid, decisive victory if Taiwan defenses crumble, that presents the U.S. with a fait accompli before the U.S. can really get its forces there. That's not an option with a blockade. It takes time to work. It gives the U.S. time to respond. Now, partly we changed this question a little bit because if we said, could they do it today, the answer would be no. They lack some of the capabilities and training. They don't have the airlift and sea lift they would need to transport invading forces. They don't have the joint training to make all the pieces work together with the delivery, invasion, and support forces. There's a limited logistics ability to support and resupply troops once they're on the island. And there's an uncertain ability of the PLA to deter U.S. intervention and conclude an invasion before the U.S. forces arrive in strength. But that said, if that's the case today, the PLA is working very hard to remedy these capabilities and training gaps, and they'll likely have at least an initial operating capability sometime over the next decade. Their target goal is 2027. I don't know whether they're going to make that precisely, but at a certain point, they will have enough to feel that they can do this, they can execute the campaign. And that's why it's worth thinking about what is the decision calculus. The pros of an invasion: potential for a decisive outcome if the PLA can execute it, possibility of a quick victory if Taiwan collapses, increased chance to do it before the U.S. can respond. However, they have to plan for and prepare for U.S. intervention, and that would make an invasion much harder to do. On the other hand, you can turn that around. If the U.S. does intervene and the PLA wins anyway, that's really a decisive defeat for the United States and one that will really change the balance of power in the Indo-Pacific and the shape of regional security. So in that point of view, the potential gains are very high if they can pull it off. The cons, Lonnie talked about a lot, very challenging, lots of moving parts. I think a greater likelihood of U.S. military intervention and maybe a wider war, maybe an extended conflict, maybe escalation. If it fails, it's obvious, and then you get the tough binary choice that Lonnie talked about. Do you admit defeat, say we taught Taiwan a lesson and go home and deal with the political consequence, or do you find a way to try to continue the conflict at a lower level of violence within your capabilities? And he suggests a blockade might be that. But by that point, I've already won the debate because the PRC's already invaded. So just to...
They blockaded first.
They blockaded first. Well, that's a Weasley answer. So just to sum up this position, a blockade done violently, done kinetically, has most of the broader economic, diplomatic, and political costs of an invasion with a much lower chance of producing a decisive outcome. If Xi Jinping and the CCP do decide they're going to roll the dice on a war of choice to unify Taiwan, I think the prospect of a decisive outcome and the chance of a rapid victory might be more attractive than a potentially inconclusive blockade that goes on and on. And while it goes on and on, the Chinese economy is mobilized for war. It's largely shut down. You've got a lot of people out of work. And so you have economic costs that China's decisions are imposing on itself, and those also increase over time. So the pain on the Chinese mainland also increases. That said, beyond the debate, first, Lonnie is clearly correct. We need to pay a lot more attention to the blockade possibility, and we need to do more to prepare for it because it is very challenging in some ways for the U.S. military. But beyond that, I think it highlights some of the challenges of net assessment of U.S. and PRC military capabilities. If we're looking at this, can they do all the things they need to do militarily to pull off an invasion? Are our new magical capabilities going to be fielded into the force and stop them? And even if we're confident they're going to be fielded into the force and stop the PLA, does the PLA know that? What is their net assessment? And what's the potential for a war based on a misperception of what the actual military balance is? So there's something to worry about even if I am right. Lots to worry about if I'm right.
Great. I think, as Philip mentioned, lots to worry about in either scenario. But let me turn the floor to Lonnie for a rebuttal. And I already started making a short list of questions, but I'm sure there will be more questions as we go into the second half of the debate.
Well, it's not so much a rebuttal because we're in violent agreement here.
I knew I persuaded you.
On this, this issue of the cost to China of doing a blockade, a lot of the discussion around we could easily defeat a blockade, we get statements like that from Eli Ratner and from Admiral Paparo, seem to be premised around the assumption that China doesn't want a war. And yeah, if China is doing a punitive blockade but is not intending to go to war with the United States, then the fact that it would cost them a lot is a serious deterrent. The fact that we could sink their navy at sea and defeat an easy blockade is a deterrent. Deterrence is strong, as Dr. Ratner said this morning. I strongly believe that the deterrence is as strong as it can be, both in terms of you are likely to fail, deterrence by denial, and it's going to cost you a lot more than you can achieve, deterrence by punishment. Deterrence is strong. That's if this were easy and cheap, they'd have done it long ago. Where deterrence breaks down, as Bonnie Glaser was saying, is that if they decide they must, despite the cost, despite the operational risk, then they will. And having made that decision, they know it's going to be enormously costly. They know it's going to destroy the Chinese economy, the global economy for decades to come. They know that it's going to be a protracted state of hostility between China and the United States, regardless of the outcome of the conflict in Taiwan. It's not a new Cold War, it's a new hot war lasting a long time. If they go to war, you're not going to further deter them. If they decide they must go to war, you're not going to further deter them by saying, but it's going to cost you a whole lot. They got it. They understand that. So deterrence is working, but deterrence is not enough. I'm trying to get an article published centered around that thesis. And if they've decided to use force to compel unification, they will be pounding the daylights out of Taiwan. There will be no question about it. They're not going to be holding back and refraining from it. I think that was all I had to say.
Before we turn to Phil, could you, we've talked a bit about sort of the more punitive, the more violent blockade. Could you actually sketch it out a little bit for folks who haven't read some of your writings? What that actually involves?
The punitive or the
more violent,
the more kinetic.
Yeah, the more kinetic blockade. Yeah. Well, I think that a punitive blockade would still be kinetic. They're still going to be shooting things. But a war to unify Taiwan with the mainland is, first of all, it's going to involve whether or not they decide to invade. So they will, on the achieve maritime superiority, if they've decided not to invade, they'll just go ahead and destroy all the ports, destroy all the airfields, destroy all the communications. If they want to invade, then they'll refrain from attacking some of those facilities because they want to use those facilities. They will also shut down air traffic in and out of Taiwan. And that's relatively easy for them to do given the enormous and extremely sophisticated air defense array that they have along the coastline opposite Taiwan. They have air defense systems that can reach all the way across the island. And U.S. can certainly sneak stealth fighters and stealth bombers through that. You're not going to get cargo jets through that, I guarantee. So there is no cargo coming in by air until and unless we can take down that air defense array. And like I said, that is the biggest and best air defense array anywhere on the planet. And maybe we've got secret weapons that'll take it down. I don't know. But nothing I know of is going to take down that array. So Chinese continue to enjoy air superiority of the island, which means that when they run out of missiles, the PLA Air Force can run up and down and freely and do whatever it wants in Taiwan. So they're continuing to bombard everything in Taiwan with their Air Force after they run out of missiles. And then the information blockade, Taiwan's not going to have any cable communications, either because they do the hard thing of cutting cables underwater or because they do the easy thing of hitting the easily identified landing point
Fixed
where that
landing
cable
points.
comes ashore. It's one little building, boom, done. Or the even easier thing, most of those cables run through Shanghai anyway, so you got to walk up and push a button. Also physically destroying communication mechanisms in China, in Taiwan rather. Also destroying the overhead assets that U.S. and Taiwan depend upon for domain awareness. So whether or not they are doing a blockade, are doing an invasion, they'll do all of those things. And then, if they don't do a landing, they'll just keep doing those things for as long as it takes. And U.S. forces, like I said, we can sink all their ships in the Western Pacific. Big deal. That doesn't get cargo into ports. And so either from the outset or after the invasion fails, it's a blockade. And so that is the main battle of this war. It's not the first battle. The first battle is to defeat the landing force, to sink the amphibious fleet. And we can and must win that first battle. But the rest of the war is a blockade. And if we can't win that, then we can't win the war.
Phil?
So I anticipated some of this because I've read Lonnie's article, which I commend to you. And, and I'll start with the point that what he is talking about is a very violent military campaign that is going to involve missile strikes, air strikes, a lot of violence, a lot of things blown up on the island, certainly people killed on the island. That's an attack on Taiwan. And it is likely to trigger the same kind of sanctions, diplomatic pressure, all of those costs that would come along with an invasion. So, you get all of that, all of those higher level political and economic costs if all you're doing is a blockade, because it's a really violent act of war. I think then the question is that decisive? For a blockade to be decisive, it has to cut off enough traffic that that the country just can't survive under those conditions. It's a lot easier to do with an island. That's one of the things the Russians found out is Ukraine has all these land borders and you can't cut them all off. But Taiwan is very, very differently situated, and you've got to get ships through there or you've got to get planes through there. There's no bridge, although they're talking about building a bridge from Xiamen. But so there's the potential for a blockade to be more effective. But the history of it is it just takes way, way, way longer that people put themselves on rations, they eat bitterness, and they're able to last for a lot longer than you would think. And to me, that makes it not such a good outcome. It gives time to mobilize that coalition. I think it would be I am persuaded by this logic that, defeating the blockade is not about sinking Chinese destroyers that are interdicting freighters or tankers. It's going to be that last 10 nautical miles when you're trying to get stuff into port. And that's got to go through a gauntlet of PRC anti-ship cruise missiles. And the only things moving on that water are going to be targets. So I think that's going to be really, really challenging. I don't think that's something we've quite got our head on, although we did a simulation here about 2 years ago where we kind of thought through some of this and was like, boy, this is a lot harder than it seems. And I was persuaded that, and Lonnie went and wrote a great article on it. But I come down to it, if you get to the point where you decide force has to be used, unification has to be achieved, I still think the invasion is the way you're going to go, because a blockade is not fast enough, it's not decisive enough, it amplifies costs rather than reducing them. And at the end of the day, you're not sure it's going to work. And so you've paid all that cost, you haven't got the island, you can keep trying to do it for a while, but indefinitely. And remember, likely the Chinese economy is shut down as well. I just don't see that as a very attractive option for a PRC decision maker. If I'm sitting in the PLA chair, I like a blockade because we can do it. And the invasion is, yeah, we think we can sort of do it, but a lot could go wrong, and a blockade is a much surer thing. But if I'm sitting in Xi Jinping's chair, it doesn't look so good because it's not decisive and it costs too much.
Thank you. Let me start off with a couple of questions before opening it to Q&A from the audience. So one question I had was actually going back to a line, Lonnie, that you mentioned, in which you described what ASD Eli Ratner, the blockade that he outlined as a picket line type of blockade. Could you spell that out a little bit more, and why you've spent your time talking about a much more kinetic blockade versus that type of blockade?
When most people talk about a maritime blockade, the model they have in their mind is the Cuban Missile Crisis, or the Battle of the Atlantic in World War II, or the British Navy blockading the coast of France in the Napoleonic Wars. That is, you have a force at sea which is intercepting shipping and turning it back or sinking it on the spot. You had German U-boats trying to sink the merchant ships crossing the North Atlantic. And given the relative capabilities of the U.S. and the Chinese Navy, I am quite confident that we would sink their fleet quickly. That if they tried to put destroyers in a picket line out east of Taiwan to stop cargo ships and force them to turn back, those destroyers would be on the bottom of the ocean, not a problem. The U.S. Navy would really enjoy that fight. But that doesn't get the cargo in. After you sink the Chinese Navy and you're able to sail 5,000 miles across the ocean, you still got that last 10 miles into Kaohsiung Port or into New Taipei Port or Taichung Port. And that's around on the west coast of the island, close to China. And the PLA has bombed the daylights out of those ports, so they're not really very functional. They have mined the entrances to those ports, and they're sitting back with whatever they've got left, which is all the short-range stuff they couldn't use in the first month of the battle, but it's still good enough to sink a cargo ship that's maneuvering slowly as it tries to get through the minefield to get into Kaohsiung Harbor. And killing that cargo ship is not hard. Protecting that cargo ship is really, really hard. And so the Blue Force, in order to succeed in this battle, has to, first of all, be ready to fight in a close-in fight with weapons coming at you from many different directions. The U.S. Navy is a lot happier standing back 300 miles and sinking things. Getting in there in tight and fighting that kind of close in, I call it a knife fight, that's different. That requires different weapons, different concept of operations, different ships, different kinds of ships. And then you've got the minefields. You've got to get through that minefield to get into the port. And every time you turn your back, China's got fishing boats and old submarines and whatever else out reseeding that minefield. So you've got to clear mines, and we don't have nearly, not by a factor of 100, enough mine clearing capacity for that task. So that's what I mean by the close-in blockade. The picket line blockade is easy to beat, and when U.S. officials express confidence that we can beat a Chinese blockade, I think that must be what they have in mind. But that doesn't get cargo into port.
I don't want to be too pessimistic here about what the United States can or cannot do. But maybe on one question related to what we were talking about here is, when we look at a very kinetic blockade, this is either for Phil or Lonnie, as we look at the escalation dynamics, are we sure that a kinetic blockade would not automatically lead to an invasion as we see escalation on both sides? Because we've been talking about as if China can maintain a kinetic blockade without that going into a larger war. What is your assessment in which escalation on the U.S. end or Taiwan's end could make this a kinetic blockade into an actual invasion?
So this is probably the point where I should have said earlier where these are my own personal views, not those of the Department of Defense, and certainly not those of the Navy or the Air Force. So part of it is what's happening on the oceans and in the airspace. And if there are active fighting going on, the Chinese will lose a lot of ships and planes, the US will lose ships and planes. And we will look at the things on the mainland that are controlling them, the surface-to-air missiles, which are probably one of the biggest threats we're facing, cruise missiles, which are one of the biggest threats, and say, we can't let those things stay up and operate. We've got to go out after the radars that target them, the command and control systems, and the systems themselves. And that gets you pretty quickly into mainland strikes. So what might have seemed, you know, again, if you're thinking a Cuban Missile Crisis kind of blockade where it's all happening off the island, I think the incentives pretty quickly are to translate into a war that has strikes going on in the mainland. That's escalatory. And does the PRC feel a political need then to find ways to strike against U.S. targets or U.S. territories, or Japan, which is probably enabling some of this or hosting some of this stuff? They don't have a lot of conventional strike capability against CONUS now, but if we're talking out 5 or 10 years, there probably is some. And let's say they do that, or they use special operations forces or some way to strike back just for the political reasons that we are striking their homeland and they feel the need to strike back. Well, now that's an escalation conflict. Does that bring NATO in? It's an attack on U.S. territory. So I think you have those kinds of escalation potential. It's also worth remembering that Taiwan has offensive capabilities of its own. They have ballistic missiles, they have cruise missiles, and they have aircraft, all of which are capable of striking the mainland. And it may well be the case, depending on what's going on the island in terms of strikes, that they feel the need politically to retaliate for that. And so it might be Taiwan that fires the first shot at the mainland. Does that create an escalatory dynamic? So it's not necessarily clear that if it starts out as a low-level blockade, it's going to stay that way, or if it starts out as a kinetic blockade, that it's not going to escalate into exchanges of airstrikes and missile strikes, whether it's PRC that initiates that, whether it's Taiwan that initiates it, or whether it's the U.S. that initiates it for operational necessity for the operational fight. So I think that, there is significant escalation potential, even if it is just a blockade.
I understood your question to be slightly different. I understood you be asking if they start off on a course of action which is focused on the blockade, at some point, will they do an invasion just because it becomes a good opportunity to do so, as opposed to starting out with that intention? No? Okay.
I think my question was more of whether the escalation dynamics would force them to do so, even though that was not their original intention.
I'm not sure the escalation dynamics would force them to do so, but I do think that as the blockade drags on, it becomes easier and easier for the Chinese to mount an invasion if they haven't done one yet. And so at some point, unless we can break the blockade, at some point the PLA is on Taiwan and in control. And different issue, alluded to earlier, if we fight and lose a war over Taiwan, it's not good for our political situation in the world. Nobody is going to feel very confident about a U.S. security guarantees after we have just failed to stop a client state from being invaded, occupied, and conquered, despite everything we could throw at it militarily. I think we should, if we are willing to get into that war in the first place, we must win it, or else we have destroyed our own place in the world.
Okay, with that, let me open it up for, for questions from the audience.